Hello and welcome to Introduction to Comparative Politics. This is Chapter 12, when policies, when markets fail, welfare, health, and the environment. So the key questions we ask as comparativists when we're thinking about this is, what do policy outcomes tell us about who has effective representation and power in a political system? Why do states intervene in the market via social, health, and environmental policies? Why have many governments pursued significant reforms to welfare states in the era of globalization? Why have states found it so difficult to reform health policy and control costs? And where and why did more effective welfare and health systems emerge? And can the most effective ones be replicated in other countries? So, welfare, social policy in a comparative perspective. So, first we need to think about what the operationalizing our terms. So, when we're thinking about social policy, that's a policy that's focused on reducing poverty and income inequality and stabilizing individual or family income. We can see this in the form of universal entitlements, social insurance, means-tested public assistance, tax expenditures, and we'll go through what each of those things are in a minute. The debate surrounding this comes down to two main things: reducing poverty and inequality versus incentives to work, and social rights of citizenship versus individual autonomy. So universal entitlements, those are basically benefits that governments provide to all citizens more or less equally, usually funded through general taxation, so money that comes out of your income taxes through every paycheck. The application will vary widely between states. It could be public education, child family allowances. It could also be things like, national health care, like you might see in England or in Germany. Other countries like that could be pensions and this kind of thing. Social insurance. That provides benefits to categories of people who have contributed to a usually mandatory public insurance fund, typically used to provide retirement pensions. So again, that's retirement, disability, unemployment. We have that here in the United States. That was instituted through FDR's reforms. They have that in most other countries. You'll get pensions upon retirement. Means-tested public assistance. Those are social programs that provide benefits to individuals who fall below a specific income level. So here in the United States, we have SNAP, that's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, commonly known as food stamps. We also have the TANF, that's Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. So basically, you have to meet a certain income threshold, and how much you get is based on whatever income level you are at. So it's not like a flat amount that you get. It's an amount you get on a sliding scale based on your specific income. Tax expenditures. This is targeted tax breaks for specific groups of citizens or activities designed to achieve social policy goals. Examples of these are like tax breaks for home purchases, tax breaks for investments and retirement plans, or earned income tax credit. So you can get like a lot of times they'll have these special programs for like first tax breaks for first-time home buyers, or You get tax breaks for, say, if you buy energy efficient windows or different things like this. So these are different types of tax expenditures. Types of welfare states. Distinct systems of social policies that arose after World War II in wealthy market economies. So we have a couple of different kinds. There's social democratic welfare states. You see these typically in the Nordic countries. Christian democratic welfare states, the best example of this would be Germany, and liberal welfare states like the United States. Social democratic welfare states. They have social policies that are strongly emphasize universal entitlements. They have paid maternity leave, preschool, child allowances, basic retirement pensions, and job training. Their main goals are to achieve greater social equality and to promote equal citizenship. So in your lesson plan, I have a video there that talks about the Nordic model, and it gives you some of the specific challenges that they're facing right now that happen like with the global downturn. And so please have a look at that. Christian democratic welfare states. Social policies are based on the nuclear family with a male breadwinner, designed primarily to achieve income stabilization to mitigate the effects of market-induced income insecurity. They're based on social insurance, and redistribution is not at the center of its existence. They're sort of an interesting example of how they operate. I think I talked about this last time. They try to focus on working with unions to try to mitigate unemployment numbers by focusing on this concept of the Christian democratic state, to try to keep people employed and these types of things. But as you'll see through this focus on austerity and liberal reforms through the Hart's welfare reforms, they went through some pretty drastic changes to their welfare system that were not particularly popular. And I have a couple of videos on that, so you can watch those, and also your book talks about this as well. Liberal welfare states. Social policies focus on ensuring that all who can do so gain their income in the market, more concerned with preserving individual autonomy than with reducing poverty or inequality. Some poor people don't get assistance. This is one of the main critiques of the liberal welfare state, is that lots of people end up falling through the cracks. You see here I have this picture of a homeless veteran. And it's not just veterans who fall through the cracks. It's lots of people who, are too rich to get assistance, but too poor to really be able to make ends meet, and can't necessarily feed their families or sometimes afford to pay rent, end up living in their cars and things like this. So this is one of the main critiques of the liberal welfare state, and that benefits don't really raise people out of poverty. One of the problems is that we have this growing gap of inequality in this country, where wages are stagnating, and the minimum wage never rose to catch up with it. The minimum wage was always meant to be a living wage, and unfortunately we have a situation now where it's not, and welfare was never meant to sustain people who are actually working. So you have people who actually, a lot of people who are on welfare are actually known as the working poor. And it's not supposed to be that way. If you're working 40 hours a week plus, you should not have to be on welfare. That was always the idea behind the minimum wage. However, because of this race to the bottom, because of globalization, because of the reduced, or because of the growing gap of income inequality, that's just unfortunately been the case, and corporations have expected the state to make up the difference in welfare benefits. And so you have a situation where people are working the 40 hours a week and are not able to make ends meet. So this is, again, one of the critiques of the liberal welfare state, and one of the many debates that we have about how to try to deal with this. Again, when we're talking about uh, when markets fail, in this chapter, what we're talking about is the concept that how society is imagining that the market is failing in all of these states, in the liberal state, in the Christian welfare state, in the social democratic state, and not necessarily that the market has completely collapsed per se, but that the society sees that the state is failing its people. And so we have these conversations amongst ourselves as far as how can we better our society and help resolve some of these issues to move forward. Because many people don't think that it's really fair, not only to those of us who are having to pay out these welfare benefits, but also to the people who are working 40 hours a week. To them, it's demeaning to have to try to ask for welfare when they shouldn't have to do that. Explaining the development and evolution of welfare states. From the perspective of development, there's three ways we can think of this: structural, cultural, and institutional. From a structural perspective, there's the concept of modernization and sharing risks. Cultural, there's religious beliefs and ethnic and racial homogeneity. Institutional, power, resources theory, and strength of labor. Please make sure you read over that in your book. Evolution, effects of globalization, reduced benefits, and shift towards flexible benefits or non-traditional workers. Again, some of the videos I have in there on Germany will talk about this concept, particularly of the reduced benefits and shift to flexible benefits and non-traditional workers. We saw this also happen a lot in the United States towards like gig economy, the gig economy, and temp workers, and people having to work multiple part-time jobs in order to try to make ends meet. Social policy in the Global South. So in the Global South, they come up with this notion as conditional cash transfers to try to deal with some of their social ills. And these are programs that provide cash grants to the poor in exchange for basically them engaging in specific behaviors. So, for example, them making sure that they're bringing their children to health clinics on a regular basis for checkups and things like this, and regular enrollment in school. These CCT programs in Latin America have reduced poverty by 4 to 8%, and they've increased school enrollment. The CCTs have spread to some Asian and African countries, but they are most prevalent in Latin America. Here's a case study on Germany. Please read that in the book. And again, I have some supporting videos for that in the lesson plan. And please make sure you look at the case study of the United States and Brazil in your book, Healthcare and Market Failure. The key problems are very high risk and poor consumer information. Both produce inefficiency and misallocation of resources. The moral hazard is that it occurs when parties to a transaction behave in a particular way because they believe that they will not have to pay the full costs of their actions. Poor information compounds the problem of overuse. So, one example is Germany's national health insurance. We also see the NHS, the National Health System, in England, also known as the single payer system. There's the market-based private insurance, which is what we have in the United States. National health insurance, this is what we see in Germany. They were the first ones in the world to actually have a national health insurance system. They came up with this. I think I talked about this last chapter or the chapter before. I can't remember, when they were going through that rapid period of industrialization under Bismarck, and he was scared of a communist revolution. So to help mitigate that, he came up with the National Health Insurance Program in the 1880s. So that's kind of a unique feature of Germany. They were the first ones to ever do this. Government mandates that virtually all citizens have insurance. They typically allow and encourage multiple private insurance providers. And the government provides access to this insurance to the self-employed or unemployed who don't have access via family members. And the government regulates the system, setting or at least limiting premiums and payments to medical providers. And it's pretty popular. It helps mandate or reduce costs and keep them to a pretty decent minimum because of the government intervention. National health system, that's also referred to as a single payer system. Hold on a second. Single payer system, government financed and managed system. So basically, all citizens, either through a separate insurance payment or via general taxation, like in United Kingdom, typically it's through their general taxes. So it comes out of their taxes, and everybody gets it. It's universal. The majority of medical professionals gain their income directly from the government. So they're basically government employees. The government controls the cost of medical care via payments for procedures, equipment, and drugs. So again, because of this sort of government regulation, they are able to sort of control the costs, and it helps keep costs down. And it's it tends to be a very efficient way to get things done. They have very strict rules on use. So, everybody knows that there are certain rules of use. I forget exactly what it is. Something like, if you have a cold, don't bother calling, to set up an appointment. Because if it's just a cold, you're just going to have to ride it out, and that's just the way it is. But, they have certain rules of when to call if you have a fever and that kind of thing. Um, and they prioritize based on immediacy, like who needs the help the most. They sort of triage it that way. And so it's very efficient, right? Those people who need the care go first, and that's how they're seen, based on emergency need and that kind of thing. So it's very efficient. It's there's there tends to be less waste, but uh, um, and it's very popular. People like the NHS in England. Market-based private insurance. The United States, Turkey, and Mexico are the only organization for economic operation development countries that rely on private insurance for the bulk of their health care. So stop and think about that. We're the only ones. That's it. So it's us, Turkey, and Mexico. Everybody else has some sort of guaranteed health insurance. Citizens typically gain insurance through their employment. So, again, think about that if you're unemployed. And even if you are employed, not all employers guarantee insurance. And many of them nowadays, insurance is getting worse, with higher deductibles and things like this, and health savings plans, and etc. Just because you have it doesn't necessarily mean it's good anyway. Medical care is provided mostly by for-profit entities, and this is another thing that's really unique to the American system because it's market-based. So all these companies are making money off of sick people. So governments don't guarantee access to health care for all of their citizens, which again is a unique feature to our system in the market-based private insurance. Whereas in the other two, everybody is guaranteed access to health care. So common problems, you can have problems controlling costs, especially in wealthy countries, access to care, especially in poor countries, also in market-based systems. So in poor countries, it can be hard, even when care is guaranteed, to get people who are in very rural areas to where they need to be. Public health, obesity, tobacco, and alcohol tend to be issues the most in wealthy countries, and sanitation and nutrition tend to be what you see the biggest problems in poor countries. Okay, Germany and the NHI, your book has a case study on that, so please take a look at that. And NHS in the United Kingdom, please have a look at that in your book. And the US, please take a look at that in your book. Environmental problems. This is a classic post-materialist concern. If you remember when we talked about post-materialist, that is where Engelhardt sort of spearheaded this notion of when a country gets to a certain point of development, they start to be concerned with issues beyond survival, and one of those things being environmental issues. So that's why it's considered a classic post-materialist concern. Engelhardt came up with that notion of post-materialism. Clear case of market failure, externalities. Remember we talked about that in the, I think, last chapter. No, it was the chapter before last, chapter 10. And Tragedy of the Commons. If you recall, we talked about Tragedy of the Commons some chapters ago. I don't remember which chapter it was. But Tragedy of the Commons is when everybody overuses resources, when people tend to overuse resources, or take advantage of or abuse resources, pollute resources, this type of thing. The effects of globalization, a race to the bottom, bringing developing countries in sustainable development. So the thing that we're looking for is, rather than this sort of race to the bottom, because where everything is trying to lower cost, and in that process, um, uh, you have a tendency to engage in activities that are not necessarily environmentally friendly, particularly in these developing countries. Um, when we're talking about bringing these developing countries in, we're looking to do so in a way that is sustainable. And so your book talks a lot about that, so please have a look at that. Risk assessment, analysis of what the risks of damaging outcomes are in a particular situation, risk management, policy used to keep risks to accessible level, precautionary principle, a policy that emphasizes risk avoidance when the science predicting risk is uncertain. Policy options, precautionary principles versus reducing costs. 3 policy options: command and control, cap and trade, and taxation. Climate change. Global externality requires global response. Mitigation and adaptation. Wealth versus poor countries. Historical carbon production, current carbon production, per capita carbon production. Development requires producing carbon, and what do you do about that, right? International efforts. So we've been trying to deal with what that means. How do we get these per capita carbon productions down? How do we mitigate that? How do we get these companies to deal with their externalities, and make them responsible for it? And how do we do that on a global level? So there's been these international efforts such as the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and the Kigali Agreement. And your book will talk about those, so have a look at that. There's a case study of the United States. Please take a look at that, and the case study of China. And that's it. So if you have any other questions, please let me know. And as always, you can Skype me and email me. Thank you very much.